The trucks stopped at the edge of the forest just before dawn, engines ticking as they cooled, their exhaust drifting into the pale morning fog. The trees stood silent and tall, their branches bare, the ground beneath them dark with damp earth. It was the kind of place that swallowed sound, where even a shout seemed afraid to travel too far. The men climbed down from the trucks in small groups, boots crunching softly, rifles slung over shoulders already tense from what they knew was coming. No one needed to ask why they were here. The orders had been clear enough. The civilians were brought last. They came in a long, uneven line guarded by soldiers who kept their eyes forward, pretending not to notice the fear that hung in the air like smoke. Old men shuffled along with hunched backs and hollow eyes. Women clutched children so tightly that some of the younger ones whimpered in protest, though even they seemed to sense that noise was dangerous. A few teenagers tried to stand straighter than the rest, as if pride alone could shield them. None of it mattered. The forest did not care, and neither, according to the orders, should the men holding the rifles. Captain Ernst Adler stood slightly apart from the others, his gloved hands clasped behind his back. He had been awake since before midnight, not from anxiety, at least not consciously, but because sleep had become a stranger to him these past months. Every time he closed his eyes, the war followed him there. Burning villages, broken roads littered with carts and bodies, faces that stared too long, even after life had left them. He was a career officer, raised on discipline and obedience, trained to believe that order was the only barrier between civilization and chaos. He had served since the beginning of the war, first in the West and then in the East, and he had learned quickly that this front was different. The rules bent here. Sometimes they vanished entirely. The written order sat folded in the pocket of his greatcoat. He had read it 3 times since receiving it the night before, hoping that repetition might make the words change. They had not. The civilians were accused of supporting partisans. No evidence was provided. None was required. The directive was simple: execution at first light. Adler watched as the prisoners were arranged at the edge of a shallow pit that had already been dug by forced laborers earlier in the night. The pit was not deep enough, not really. It never was. The men who dug it had known what it was for. Some had wept while they worked. Others had stared into nothing, already gone somewhere far away inside themselves. A lieutenant approached Adler, boots clicking sharply. He was young, too young for lines like the ones already etched into his face. "Herr Hauptmann," he said, voice low, "the men are ready." Adler nodded, though his throat felt tight. He stepped forward, the authority of his rank creating a small clearing around him. The soldiers straightened instinctively, hands tightening on their rifles. They had been trained to look to him for direction. That, more than anything, weighed on him now. He cleared his throat and looked out over the formation. Some of the men avoided his gaze. Others stared straight back, eyes empty, waiting to be told what to do so they wouldn't have to think about it themselves. "Men," Adler began, his voice steady despite the storm inside him, "you have been informed of today's operation." No one spoke. Somewhere in the forest, a bird startled into flight, its wings beating loudly for a moment before the sound faded. Adler's eyes drifted back to the civilians. A woman near the center of the line was whispering to a small boy, brushing his hair back with trembling fingers. The child looked up at her with absolute trust. That look struck Adler harder than any explosion ever had. He thought of his own son, far away in a city that still had electricity and schools and bread. He thought of the last letter he had received, written in uneven pencil lines, proudly announcing that the boy had learned to read on his own. He imagined that letter lying on his desk at home, waiting for a father who might return a different man, or not at all. The order burned in his pocket. He took a breath. "I will speak plainly," Adler said. "What we are about to do is not combat. These people are unarmed." The lieutenant shifted uncomfortably. A few soldiers exchanged quick glances. "The directive," Adler continued, choosing each word carefully, "claims they are collaborators. I have seen no proof of this." A murmur rippled through the ranks, barely audible but unmistakable. Doubt, once introduced, had a way of spreading. Adler felt his pulse pounding in his ears. He knew the risks. He knew the stories, of officers relieved of command, of men transferred to penal units, of disappearances explained with vague phrases and empty forms. He also knew something else, something quieter but far more persistent. That if he gave the order now, it would follow him for the rest of his life, if he survived at all. He turned fully toward his men. "I will not order you to fire on civilians," he said. For a moment, the forest seemed to hold its breath. The lieutenant stared at him, eyes wide. "Herr Hauptmann," he said urgently, "the orders." "I am aware of the orders," Adler cut in, his voice firm but not raised. "I am also aware of my responsibility as an officer. I will not be responsible for this." Silence fell again, heavier than before. Somewhere behind the line, a soldier's rifle slipped slightly, the strap creaking as he adjusted it. No one moved otherwise. Adler felt an unexpected calm settle over him. The decision, once made, had cleared something inside him. Fear was still there, but it no longer ruled him. He stepped closer to the lieutenant. "You may report this to regimental headquarters," he said. "You may also note that until I receive a direct, written order addressed specifically to me, verified through proper channels, this unit will not carry out executions." The lieutenant swallowed. He was torn between loyalty and terror, between the man standing in front of him and the faceless authority behind the order. "They won't accept that," he whispered. "Then they won't," Adler replied. "But this ends here." Behind them, the civilians watched in confusion, not understanding the words but sensing that something had changed. The woman with the child tightened her grip, her eyes darting from face to face, searching for meaning. Minutes passed. Then more. The sun crept higher, thin rays piercing the fog and lighting the clearing in pale gold. Every second that passed without gunfire felt unreal, like borrowed time. At last, a sergeant broke the silence. "Herr Hauptmann," he said hesitantly, "what should we do with the prisoners?" Adler turned toward him. "They will remain here under guard," he said. "No one fires a shot. Is that understood?" A few voices answered quietly, "Jol." Not everyone spoke. Not everyone needed to. The waiting was almost worse than the decision. Adler knew that word would spread quickly. Someone would report him. Someone always did. He imagined the phone call that would come, the clipped voice on the other end demanding explanations. He imagined the look on his superior's face, a mix of anger and calculation. But as he stood there, watching his men lower their rifles, he also saw something else. Shoulders eased slightly. Hands stopped shaking. A few soldiers looked at the ground, as if ashamed of their own relief. An hour later, the sound of engines broke the stillness again. A staff car appeared on the dirt road leading into the clearing, followed by another truck. Adler felt his muscles tense. This was it. An officer stepped out of the car, his uniform immaculate, his expression cold. He surveyed the scene with a practiced eye, taking in the untouched pit, the living prisoners, the soldiers standing idle. "Captain Adler," the officer said sharply, "explain this." Adler stepped forward, saluted, and met his gaze. "I refuse to carry out an illegal order," he said. His voice did not waver. The officer's eyes narrowed. "You presume to decide what is legal?" "I presume to follow the laws of war and the regulations of the army," Adler replied. "These people were to be executed without trial. I will not participate in that." For a long moment, the only sound was the wind moving through the trees. The officer exhaled slowly, as if restraining himself. "You understand what this means," he said. "Yes," Adler answered. And he did. Behind him, the civilians waited, their fate suspended on words they could not hear, on a choice already made by one man who had decided that obedience had a limit. The officer finally turned away, barking orders to his driver and to the men who had arrived with him. The prisoners were to be transferred. The situation would be reviewed. Adler was instructed to return to headquarters immediately. As Adler walked back toward the trucks, he felt the weight of countless eyes on him. His men's, the civilians, even the forests. He did not know what would happen next. He only knew that for this morning, at least, no shots had been fired. And sometimes, in a war built on death, that alone felt like a victory. The refusal did not end the danger. In fact, once the first shots echoed from the clearing and the executions continued without him, the officer understood that he had crossed an invisible line. He was no longer simply a man who had hesitated. He was now someone who had openly challenged the machinery of killing. That realization settled heavily on him as the day wore on. He watched smoke drift lazily above the trees and listened to the muffled reports of rifles carried by the wind. Each sound marked another life taken, another moment he could not undo. Yet, despite the horror, he felt a strange clarity. For the first time since the war began, he knew with certainty that he had done the only thing he could live with. When he returned to headquarters that evening, silence followed him into every room. Other officers avoided his gaze. Some looked at him with irritation, others with something closer to fear. No one said it aloud, but everyone understood what his refusal meant. If one officer could say no, then obedience was not as absolute as they had been taught to believe. That idea was dangerous, far more dangerous than any single act of defiance. Orders relied on the belief that resistance was impossible. He had proven otherwise. The report of his refusal moved upward through channels quickly. Within days, he was summoned to explain himself. The interrogation was formal but tense. He was asked why he had refused, whether he understood the seriousness of disobeying orders, whether he grasped the consequences of undermining discipline during wartime. He answered calmly, repeating that the order had been illegal, that executing unarmed civilians violated military law and basic principles of humanity. Each word felt like another step toward an uncertain fate. What surprised him most was not the anger of his superiors, but their caution. They did not immediately threaten him with execution. Instead, they argued. They questioned his interpretation of the law, suggested he was naive, accused him of allowing emotion to override duty. One officer leaned forward and told him quietly that history would not remember his conscience, only his obedience or lack of it. The officer listened, unmoved. He had already accepted that history might condemn him. What he could not accept was condemning himself. Eventually, the interrogation ended without resolution. He was dismissed and told to wait for further orders. That waiting was perhaps the hardest part. Every knock on the door sent a jolt through him. Every footstep in the corridor sounded like the approach of arrest. Days passed, then weeks. In that time, he replayed the moment of refusal again and again, not to question it, but to understand it. He realized that his decision had not been heroic in the way people liked to imagine. It had not been driven by grand ideals or dramatic gestures. It had been a quiet, almost mundane realization that if he raised his weapon, something inside him would break beyond repair. News filtered back from the front. The war continued with relentless brutality. Executions, deportations, and massacres went on regardless of his stand. This knowledge weighed heavily on him. He had stopped nothing in the larger sense. The killings continued, the machinery rolled forward, indifferent to individual conscience. Yet he also knew that his refusal had mattered in one crucial way. It had defined who he was. In a system designed to erase personal responsibility, he had reclaimed it, if only for himself. Eventually, the consequences arrived. He was arrested and charged, not with refusing to carry out an execution, but with undermining morale and discipline. The wording was deliberate. It shifted the focus away from the victims and onto the supposed danger of his example. During the trial, prosecutors argued that his actions could inspire others to hesitate, to question orders, to weaken the unity required for victory. He listened as his refusal was transformed into an abstract threat, stripped of its moral core. The trial was brief. There was no dramatic defense, no impassioned speeches. He stated his position once more, calmly and clearly. He cited military codes, international law, and his own conscience. The verdict was a prison sentence. It could have been worse. He knew that. Others had vanished for less. As he was led away, he felt neither relief nor regret, only a deep exhaustion. Prison life was harsh but strangely stabilizing. The routines were strict, the days monotonous. Yet within those walls, he no longer had to pretend. He was no longer required to salute orders he found abhorrent or to participate in actions that haunted his sleep. He spent long hours thinking, reading when permitted, and writing letters that were often censored or never sent. He wondered about the people who had been executed that day, their names, their faces, the lives that had ended in that forest. He wondered whether any of them would have wanted him to do more, to shout louder, to resist more forcefully. He had no answers. As the war dragged on, the world outside the prison changed. Bombs fell on cities, fronts shifted, and the certainty of victory dissolved into desperation. Guards became less confident, more nervous. Rumors circulated about defeats, about advancing enemy forces, about the possibility that the war might be lost. In those moments, the officer felt a grim sense of vindication, not because he wanted defeat, but because the illusion of moral necessity that justified so many crimes was finally cracking. When the war ended, the prison gates eventually opened. He emerged into a world that was shattered and disoriented. The regime that had demanded unquestioning obedience was gone. Cities lay in ruins, families were broken, and the full scale of the crimes committed in the name of duty was beginning to surface. He returned to civilian life quietly, without celebration or recognition. There were no medals for refusal, no parades for conscience. In the years that followed, he was called to testify. Investigators wanted to understand how ordinary men had become participants in extraordinary crimes. They asked him why he had refused when so many others had complied. He struggled to answer. There was no single reason, no clear moment of enlightenment. He spoke instead about limits, about lines that once crossed could never be uncrossed, about the realization that obedience did not absolve responsibility. Some listened with respect, others with skepticism. A few dismissed his story as an exception, an anomaly that did not challenge the broader narrative of coercion and fear. He did not argue with them. He knew that his experience did not erase the suffering of millions or absolve those who had chosen differently. But he also knew that the idea that refusal was impossible was a lie, one that served only to comfort those who wanted to believe they had no choice. As time passed, his story faded from public attention. He lived an unremarkable life, working quietly, raising a family, carrying memories he rarely shared. Yet the weight of that moment in the forest never left him. It shaped how he saw authority, how he taught his children about responsibility, how he understood the fragile line between obedience and morality. Decades later, historians would uncover records of similar refusals, scattered and incomplete, hidden in archives and trial transcripts. His case would be one among many, a small but significant thread in a larger tapestry. Together, these stories would challenge the simplistic notion that everyone who participated in the machinery of death did so under unavoidable compulsion. They would reveal a more uncomfortable truth, that choices, however constrained, still existed. For the officer, this recognition came too late to change his life, but not too late to matter. He understood that his refusal had not stopped a war or saved a nation. It had not even saved the people who died that day. But it had preserved something essential, something fragile and easily lost in times of terror. The idea that even in the darkest circumstances, a human being can choose not to become an executioner. That, he believed, was the real significance of his act. Not as a symbol of heroism, but as a reminder that systems of violence rely on the willingness of individuals to participate, and that every refusal, no matter how small or costly, exposes the truth that participation is a choice. Long after the echoes of gunfire had faded, that truth remained, quiet but stubborn, waiting to be remembered.